Hi, and welcome back to the Rolling Darkness Review channel. Let's find out what we're going to entertain ourselves with today in the random darkness generator. Well, that's almost back to the here it is, almost back to the beginning. This is from the 2006 chapbook, which is only the second year we did a chapbook for the show. 2006. I will be reading a story from it, my story called Between the Cold Moon and the Earth. But first, this is very appropriate. This was the year that the Snowman's Skull shot glass premiums were made available to the adoring throngs at the shows. So, Snowman's Skull vodka, sláinte. Thank you for your patience. Between the Cold Moon and the Earth. They only brushed his cheek for a second or two, but her lips were fucking freezing. Christ, Carol, he said, do you want me coat? She laughed. What for? She asked. Because it's 1 a.m, he said, and you're cold. It's summer, she pointed out, which was undeniably true, but wasn't really the issue. Are you going to walk me home then? She said. Michael had left the others about 40 minutes earlier. Kirk had apparently copped off with the girl from Woolworths that they'd met inside the pub, so Michael and Terry had tactfully peeled away before the bus stop and started walking the long way home around Sefton Park. He could have split a taxi fare with Terry, but given that they were still in the middle of their ongoing argument about the relative merits of T-Rex and Pink Floyd, and that it was still a good 6 months before they'd find Roxy music to agree on, they'd parted by unspoken consent, and Michael had opted to cut across the park alone. Carol had been standing on the path beside the huge park's large boating lake. He'd practically shit himself when he first saw the shadowed figure there, assuming the worst, a midnight skinhead parked on watch, ready to whistle his mates out of hiding to give this handy glam rock faggot a good kicking. But Carol had been doing nothing more threatening than staring out at the centre of the lake and the motionless full moon reflected there. All right, Michael, she'd said, before he'd quite recognised her in the moonlight, and had kissed his cheek lightly in further greeting before he'd spoken her name. Now he fell into step beside her, and they began to walk the long, slow curve around the lake. God, Carol, where have you been? He asked. Nobody's seen you for months. It was true. Her mum had remarried just before last Christmas and they'd moved. Not far away. Still in the same city, but far enough for 16-year-olds to lose touch. I went to America, Carol said. Michael turned his head to see if she was kidding. You went to America? He said. What do you mean you went to America? When? Who with? Her eyes narrowed for a moment, as if she were rechecking her facts or her memory. I think it was America, she said. You think it was America? It might have been an imaginary America, she said, her voice a little impatient. Do you want to hear the fucking story or not? Oh. Michael didn't smile, nor attempt to kiss her, but he felt like doing both. Telling stories, real, imagined, or some happy collision of the two, had been one of the bonds between them, one of the things he loved about her. Not the only thing, of course. It's not like he hadn't shared Kirk and Terry's enthusiastic affection for her astonishingly perfect breasts and for the teasingly challenging way she had about her that managed to suggest two things simultaneously that, were circumstances to somehow become magically right, she might, actually do it with you, and that you were probably and permanently incapable of ever conjuring such circumstances. But her stories and her delight in telling them were what he'd loved most, and what he now realised he'd most missed. So yes, he said, he wanted to hear the story. There was some quick confusion about whether she'd got there by plane or by ship. Carol had never been a big fan of preamble. But apparently what mattered was that after a few days, she found herself in a roadside diner with a bunch of people she hardly knew. They were on a road trip, and they'd stopped for lunch in this back of beyond and unpretentious diner, a place which, while perfectly clean and respectable, looked like it hadn't been painted or refurbished since about 1952. They were in a booth, eating pie and drinking coffee. Her companions were about her age, but could, drive and everything. It turned out boys in America could be just as fucking rude as in Liverpool. One of them, Tommy, she thought his name was giving shit to the waitress. Hoisting his empty coffee mug, he was leaning out of the booth and looking pointedly down the length of the room. "Yo, still need a refill here," he shouted to the counter. Carol stood up and, announcing she was going to the ladies' room, slid her way out of the booth. Halfway down the room, she crossed paths with the waitress, who was hurrying toward their booth with a coffee pot. The woman's name tag said Cindy, Cindi, a spelling Carol had never seen before, and hoped could possibly be short for Cinderella, because that'd be, great. Carol spoke softly to her, nodding back towards Tommy, who was impatiently shaking his empty coffee mug in the air. "Don't mind him, love," Carol said. "He's a bit of a prick, but I'll make sure he leaves you a nice tip." Cindy, who was harried looking and appeared to be at least 30, gave her a quick smile of gratitude. "Little girl room's out back, sweetheart," she said. Carol exited the main building of the diner and saw that a separate structure, little more than a shack really, housed the bathrooms. She started across the gravelled parking lot, surrounded by scrub grass that was discoloured and overgrown, looking down the all but deserted country road. The type of road she'd been informed by her new friends, which was known as a 2-lane blacktop. The diner and its shit-house annex were the only buildings for as far as her eye could see, apart from a hulking grain silo 100 yards or so down the road. As Carol looked in that desolate direction, a cloud drifted over the sun, dimming the summer daylight and shifting the atmosphere into a kind of pre-storm dreariness. Carol shivered and wondered, not without a certain pleasure in the mystery, just where the hell she was. Done peeing and alone in the bathroom, Carol washed her hands and splashed her face at the pretty crappy single sink that was all the place had to offer. The sound of the ancient cistern laboriously and noisily refilling after her flush played in the background. Carol turned off the tap and looked for a moment at her reflection in the pitted and stained mirror above the sink. As the cistern finally creaked and whistled to a halt, the mirror suddenly cracked noisily across its width, as if it was just too tired to keep trying. "Fucking hell," said Carol, because it had made her jump, and because she didn't like the newly mismatched halves of her reflected face. She turned around, ready to walk out of the bathroom, and discovered she was no longer alone. A little girl, 6, 7 years old, was standing, silent and perfectly still, outside one of the stall doors, looking up at her. Oddly, the little girl was holding the palm of one hand over her right eye. "Oh, shit," said Carol, remembering that she just said "fucking hell" in front of a kid. "I didn't know you were..." She paused, smiled, started over. "Hello, pet. Do you live round here?" The little girl just kept looking at her. "What's your name?" Carol asked her, still smiling, but still getting no response. Registering the hand over the eye thing, she tried a new tack. "Oh," she said, "are we playing a game and nobody told me the rules? All right then, here we go." Raising her hand, Carol covered her own right eye with her palm. The little girl remained still and silent. Carol lowered her hand from her face. "Peekaboo," she said. Finally, the little girl smiled shyly and lowered her own hand. She had no right eye at all, just a smooth, indented bank of flesh. Carol was really good. She hardly jumped at all, and her gasp was as short-lived as could reasonably be expected. The little girl's voice was very matter-of-fact. "Mama lost my eye patch," she said. Oh, that's a shame, said Carol, trying to keep her own voice as equally every day. She's going to get me another one when she goes to town. Oh, well, that's good. Will she get a nice colour? Do you have a favourite colour? The little girl shrugged. What are you, retarded? She said. It's an eye patch. Who cares what colour it is? Carol didn't know whether to laugh or slap her. You can go now if you like, said the little girl. I have to make water. Oh, all right, sure. Well, look after yourself, Carol said, and raised her hand in a slightly awkward wave of farewell. And raising her hand in a slightly awkward wave of farewell, headed for the exit door. The little girl called after her. You take care in those woods now, Carol, she said. I hadn't told her my name, said Carol. Well, that was weird, Michael said. Carol smiled, pleased. That wasn't weird, she said. It got weird later, after I got lost in the woods. You got lost in the woods? Carol nodded. Why'd they let you go wandering off on your own? Who? Your new American friends, the people you were in the cafe with. Ha! Cafe. Diner, stupid. We were in America. Yeah, whatever. How could they let you get lost? Oh, yeah. She thought for a second, looking out to the side at the boating lake and its ghost moon. Well, perhaps they weren't there to begin with. It doesn't matter. Listen. Turned out Carol did get lost in the woods. Quite deep in the woods, actually. Heart of the forest, Hansel and Gretel shit, where the sunlight through the thickening trees was dappled and spotty, and where the reassuring blue sky of what was left of the afternoon could be glimpsed only occasionally through the increasingly oppressive canopy of high, leafy branches. Carol was tramping her way among the trees and the undergrowth, on the mossy and leaf-strewn ground, when she heard the sound for the first time. Faint and plaintive, and too distant to be truly identifiable, it was nevertheless suggestive of something that Carol couldn't quite put her finger on yet. Only when it came again, a few moments later, did she place it. It was the sound of a lonely ship's horn in a midnight ocean, melancholy and eerie. Not quite as eerie, though, as the fact that once the horn had sounded this second time, all the other sounds stopped. All the other sounds that Carol hadn't even been consciously aware of until they disappeared. Birdsong, the footsteps of unseen animals moving through the woods, the sigh of the breeze as it whistled through the branches. The only sounds now were those she made herself. The rustle and sway of the living branches she was pushing her way through, and the crackle and snap of the dead ones she was breaking beneath her. Carol began to wonder if moving on in the same direction she'd been going was that great of an idea. She turned around and started heading back, and within a few yards, stepping out from between two particularly close trees, she found herself in a small, grove-like clearing that she didn't remember passing through earlier. There was a downed and decaying tree trunk lying in the leafy undergrowth that momentarily and ridiculously put Carol in mind of a park bench. But she really wasn't in the mood to sit and relax, and it wasn't like there was, a boating lake to look at the moon in or anything. So she kept moving, across the clearing, past the downed trunk, and stopped only when the voice spoke from behind her. What's your rush, sweetheart? Carol turned back. Sitting perched on the bench-like trunk was a sailor. He was dressed in a square-necked deck shirt and bell-bottomed pants, and Carol might have taken a moment to wonder if sailors still dressed like that, if she hadn't been too busy being surprised just to see him at all. He was sitting in profile to her, one leg on the ground, the other arched up on the trunk, and he didn't turn to face her fully, perhaps because he was concentrating on rolling a cigarette. Ready-mades are easier, the sailor said, but I like the ritual. Opening the paper, laying in the tobacco, rolling it up. You know what I mean? I don't smoke, said Carol, which wasn't strictly true. But who the fuck was he to deserve the truth? You chew? He asked. Chew what? Tobacco. Ugh, no. The sailor chanted something rhythmic in response, like he was singing her a song, but knew his limitations when it came to carrying a tune. Down in Nagasaki where the fellas chew tobacco and the women wicky-wacky woo. Carol stared at him, confused, not necessarily nervous, not yet. She gestured out at the woods. "Where'd you come from?" she said. "Dahlonega, Georgia, little town northeast of Atlanta, foot of the Appalachians." That wasn't what she'd meant, and she started to tell him so, but he interrupted. "Ever been to Nagasaki, honey bun?" "No." "How about Shanghai?" The sailor was still sitting in profile to her, talking to her but staring straight ahead into the woods and beyond. He didn't wait for a reply. "Docked there once," he said. "Didn't get shore leave. Fellas who did told me I missed something, boy. Said there were whores there could practically tie themselves in knots. Real limber. A man likes that. Likes 'em limber." Carol was very careful not to say anything at all. Not to move, not to breathe. "Clean, too," said the sailor. "That's important to me. Well, who knows? Maybe I'll get back there one of these days. Of course, once they get a good look at me, I might have to pay extra." He turned finally to face her. "What do you think?" Half of his face was bone-pale and bloated, as if it had drowned years ago and been underwater ever since. His hair hung dank like seaweed, and something pearl-like glinted in the moist, dripping blackness of what used to be an eye socket. "Jesus Christ," Carol said, frozen in shock, watching helplessly as the sailor put his cigarette in his half-ruined mouth, lit it, and inhaled. "Calling on the Lord for salvation," he said. "Good for you. Might help." Smoke oozed out from the pulpy white flesh that barely clung to the bone beneath his dead face. Might not. He rose to his feet and grinned at her. "Used to chase pigs through the Georgia pines, sweet thing," he said, flinging his cigarette aside. "Let's see if you're faster than them little squealers." And then he came for her. "I was a lot faster, though," said Carol, "but it still took me 10 minutes to lose him." "Fuck, Carol," said Michael, "that wasn't funny." "I didn't say it was funny. I said it was weird, remember?" Michael turned to look at her, and she tilted her face to look up at his, dark eyes glinting, adorably proud of herself. They'd walked nearly a full circuit of the lake now, neither of them even thinking to branch off in the direction of the park's northern gate and the way home. "Well, it was weird, all right," said Michael. "Creepy ghost sailor. Pretty good." "Yeah," she said. "Turns out there was a ship went down there in the Second World War. All hands lost." "Went down in the woods. That was a good trick." "It wasn't the woods. Didn't I tell you that? It was the beach. That's where it all happened." "Was it Redondo?" "The fuck's Redondo?" she said, genuinely puzzled. "Well, it's a beach," he said. "In America, I've heard of it. It's on that Patti Smith album." "Oh, yeah. No, this wasn't in America. It was in Cornwall." She thought about it for a moment. "Yeah, had to be Cornwall because of the rock pool." "You didn't say anything about a rock pool," he said. "I haven't told you yet," she said, exasperated. "Got your rubbish." Michael laughed, even though something else had just hit him. He was walking on a moonlit night alone with a beautiful girl, and it apparently wasn't occurring to him to try anything. He hadn't even put his arm around her, for Christ's sake. Terry and Kirk would give him such shit for this when he told them. He wondered for the first time if that was something Carol knew. If that was what had always been behind her stories, why she found them, why she told them, like some instinctive Scheherazade keeping would-be lovers at bay with narrative strategies. He felt something forming in him, a kind of sadness that he couldn't name and didn't understand. "Is everything all right, Carol?" he asked, though he couldn't say why. "Well, it is now," she said, deaf to the half-born subtext in his question. "I got away. I escaped. But that spoils the story, dickhead. You got to hear what happened first." The park was silver grey in the light from the moon. He wondered what time it was. "The rock pool," he said. "Exactly," she said, pleased that he was paying attention. She hadn't seen it at first, had kept moving along the deserted beach until the sandy shore gave way to rocky, cave-strewn outcrops from the cliffs above the coastline. It was only when she clambered over an algae and seaweed-coated rock wall that she found it. Orphaned from the sea and held within a natural basin formation, the pool was placid and still and ringed by several large boulders about its rim. It was about 20 feet across and looked to be fairly deep. On one of the boulders, laid out as if waiting for their owner, were some items of clothing: a dress, a pair of stockings, some underwear. Carol looked from them out to the cool, inviting water of the pool. A head broke surface as she looked, and a woman started swimming toward the rock where her clothes were. Catching sight of Carol, she stopped and trod water, looking at her suspiciously. "What are you doing?" she said. "Are you spying?" She was older than Carol, about her mum's age, maybe, a good-looking 35. "No, I'm not," Carol said. "Why would I be spying?" "You might be one of them," the woman said. "One of who?" The woman narrowed her eyes and looked at Carol appraisingly. "You know who," she said. "No, I don't," Carol said, "and I'm not one of anybody. I was with some friends. We went to France, just got back. The boat's down there on the beach." "They've all got stories," the woman said. "That's how they get you." "Who? Stop talking shit, will ya?" Carol bit her tongue, and for the first time the woman smiled. "Are you moderating your language for me?" she said. "That's adorable." Carol felt strangely flustered. Was this woman flirting with her? "I understand," the woman said, still smiling, still staring straight into Carol's eyes. "I'm an older lady and you want to be polite. But you know, I'm not really that much older." She stepped out of the pool and stood there right in front of Carol, glistening wet and naked. "See what I mean?" she said. Carol felt funny. She swallowed. The woman kept her eyes fixed on Carol as she stepped very close to her. "I'm going to tell you a secret," she said, and leaned forward to whisper the secret in Carol's ear. "I'm real limber for my age." Carol jumped back as the woman's voice began a familiar rhythmic chant. "Down in Nagasaki where the fellas chew tobacco and the women wicky-wacky woo." Carol tried to run, but the woman had already grabbed her by the throat. "What's your rush, sweetheart?" she said, and her voice was different now, guttural and amused. "Party's just getting started." Carol was struggling in the choking grip. She tried to swing a fist at the woman's head, but her punch was effortlessly blocked by the woman's other arm. "Your eyes are so pretty," the woman said. "I'm going to have them for earrings." Her mouth opened inhumanly wide. Her tongue flicked out with reptile speed. It was long and black and forked. "But like I said," Carol, "I escaped." "How?" said Michael, expecting another previously unmentioned element to be brought into play, like a knife or a gun or a really sharp stick, or a last-minute rescue from her Francophile friends from the recently invented boat. But Carol had a different ending in mind. "I walked into the moon," she said. Michael looked up to the night sky. "No," said Carol, "not that moon. This one." She was pointing out towards the centre of the utterly calm lake and the perfect moon reflected there. Looking at it with her neither of them walking now. Michael felt the cold of the night, as if for the first time. He waited in silence, afraid to speak, afraid to give voice to his questions, afraid that they would be answered. She told another story then, the last, he knew, that his sweet lost friend would ever tell him. The tale of how the other moon had many ways into and out of this world, through placid lakes on summer evenings, through city streets on rain-slicked nights, from out of the ocean depths for the eyes of lonely night-watch sailors. And when she was done, when Michael could no longer pretend not to know in whose company he truly was, she turned to him and smiled a heartbreaking smile of farewell. She looked beautiful in monochrome, in the subtle tones of the moon that had claimed her for its own, not drained of colour, but richly reimagined, painted in shades of silver, grey and black and delicate lunar blue. She looked almost liquid, as if, were Michael to reach out a hand and even try to touch her, she might ripple into strange expansions of herself. "Thanks, Michael," she said. "I can make it home from here." Michael didn't say anything, didn't know what he could possibly find to say that the tears in his young eyes weren't already saying. The beautiful dead girl pointed a silver finger beyond him in the direction of his life. "Go on," she said kindly. "Don't look back." And he didn't look back. Not even when he heard the impossible footsteps on the water. Not even when he heard the shadow moon sigh in welcome and the quiet lapping of the lake water, as if something had slipped effortlessly beneath it. He'd later hear the alternative versions, of course, the stories of how, one moonlit night, Carol had walked out of the third-floor window of her stepfather's house, and the vile rumours as to why. But he would prefer, for all his days, to believe the story that the lost girl herself had chosen to tell him. He continued home through the park, not even breaking step, as his fingers sought and found the numb spot on his cheek, the frozen place where her cold lips had blessed him, waiting for her frostbite kiss to bloom in tomorrow's mirror.